This was a great and significant event, probably one of the biggest achievements and victories for the Ummah of Muhammad ﷺ since the fall of the Khilafah. This revolution was blessed from start to finish. America, the West, did everything possible to keep Assad in power. And Assad fell in spite of the international will. Some of the chants in the uprising itself, they were not under any illusion that this is a fact. They were calling Ya Bashar, Ya Jaban, Ya Amil American. Or Bashar, you're a coward, you are an agent of the Americans. So the Syrians knew that, and they knew that Assad could not have remained in power without American approval and enablement. It's like a dream come true. They had never imagined that they would wake up one day without Assad being there. They walk into Damascus and suddenly they do not meet the demands of the revolution. So they do not implement the Sharia. They don't even the white banner, that the white flag of Islam they used to carry as the banner. They all of a sudden they dropped it from day one. When we take the pragmatic and seemingly easier approach, you think that you have saved the ummah. But yes, in the short term you might secure Syria, but in the long run, what would happen? You would end up paying a lot more in terms of bloodshed, and you'll end up suffering more and pay double the price for wanting to be liberated again from the same world order that gave us Asad and gave us Sisi and all these talents. But we are reminded that Islam is the only permanent thing over there in Bilad al-Sham.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to the Narrative House podcast. Alhamdulillah, we are joined today by Anas to talk about Syria after the 1 year anniversary of the fall of Assad. Assalamu alaikum, Anas, and welcome to the podcast.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me.
Barakallahu feekum. To begin the podcast, obviously it's been 1 year since the fall of the Assad regime on the 8th of December. So can you tell us a bit about the fall of the Assad regime? Should we consider it to be a victory, or was it a failure of the revolution?
Jazakumullah khair once again for hosting me on this important conversation. I would say on a topic that is very close to our hearts as Muslims, Syria and Bilad al-Sham. I want to start by saying that it's important for us to set the right framing for this discussion, because when I look at Syria, we need to have a particular view around what's happened there. And that viewpoint should center around two matters that are completely separate. One is the fall of Assad and what that represents, and not just to the Muslims in Syria, but to the Ummah at large. And the second matter is the post-Assad era up until this point in time. I think we should not conflate both matters. We should assess each event on its merits, because it's very important to unpack, because what tends to happen is a group of people that will look at the current trajectory in Syria, for instance, and say it's all doom and gloom. And then there's another group of people that would just overlook or disregard any criticism over the current trajectory, citing that the fall of Assad was a big victory. So rather, we need to look at both events, and this is the context in which we should have this conversation. The fall of Assad is a significant event in the history of the Muslims in Syria. It's a turning point, a real turning point in the history of the region, of which I would say the ramifications have not been seen yet. It's one of those events that will have lasting effects. We have not seen the full potential and the outcome of that yet, but I would assure you that this was a great and significant event, probably one of the biggest achievements and victories for the Ummah of Muhammad ﷺ since the fall of the Khilafah. You ask,
and I think I think that this is something that shouldn't be understated. The Assad regime had wrought its brutality on the people of Bilad al-Sham, on the people of Syria in particular. We saw, for example, what happened during even his father's regime, Hafid al-Assad in Hama, the massacres that happened during his regime as well. So you're absolutely right. This was really a watershed moment, the fall of Assad. And I think I really like the fact that you've separated these two things right? Which is number one, the significance of the fall of Asad, and as you rightfully stated, that this was, a great victory for the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But also as well what happened after, right? We don't sort of just paint everything as being roses, but we sort of describe the reality. So can you just elaborate upon that stage further, right? With the fall of Asad, what happened exactly, what led up to it, and what resulted from that?
Yeah, sure. So it can't be understated, as we just pointed out. You talk to any Syrian, and the huge relief that they are going through because of the fall of Assad. There was a joke in Syria before, in the Assad era, and this joke would be funny if it wasn't so serious. And the joke used to say that the only time Syrians would open their mouth was at the dentist. Again, if it would be funny if it wasn't so serious, because Syria was under such a brutal tyranny for over 50 or 60 years under the Ba'ath Party, Hafiz Assad followed by Bashar Assad, that no one is allowed to speak up, no one is allowed to express any dissent, let alone any form of activism. There was a period in time there was activism and was met with harsh repercussions. Apart from that, the country was living in this massive and big jail, which is not an exaggeration. That's the context in which this event happened. It was a monumental day for Syria, for the Muslims in Syria, for the region at large, because when you look at the regime of Assad wasn't just a tyrant who happened to oppress the people of Syria for the sake of power and maintaining power. It was one of the key pillars of the post-colonial structure, the post-colonial architecture in the Middle East. The Assad regime was one of the key pillars in the region to sustain the dominance of the West, to prevent the revival of Islam and Muslims, and to protect the entity, the dynasty entity that is. So that is what this fall of Assad represented, really. It's way beyond just freedom from tyranny. It's the end of an era whereby Muslims are able to now have a big chance at forming and crafting and carving their own path and way forward. And that's what we see today. There's a lot of opportunities in that regard.
And before we get onto that, obviously, I find it really strange that a small minority from within Syria, the Alawite community, are able to instate someone. I think they're approximately about 10% of the population. They're able to instate someone to rule the country for so long. Could you give us a bit of background as to how this sort of happened? Because I know you said that this is a basic byproduct of colonialism, what the French and the British did in the region. But how did this happen in the first place?
I want to draw people's attention to one fact, and that is, the colonial powers, they understand very well the significance of this piece of land that's called Bilad al-Sham. They understand very well the role of this particular land, Bilad al-Sham, which is today Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, before the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the role that this region has played in repelling past invasions and the Crusader invasions in particular. So they placed so much emphasis and attention on this piece of land, Bilad al-Sham, in order to never rise again after World War I. Obviously, they colonized the entire Muslim world, but Bilad al-Sham specifically because of its significance, and they understand very well that if Damascus was to be liberated from colonial influence, it would signal the end of Western dominance in the Middle East and beyond. So they placed the worst of tyrants in the Middle East, in the Bilad al-Sham region. So they placed the Alawites in Syria in that context, and they gave Lebanon to the Maronites, and they gave the Philistine to the Zionists. And as such, they had this particular setup, which was by design, in order to suffocate the region and suppress Islam to an extent that it would be impossible to rise again. And subhanAllah, we will come to how the Sunnah of Allah never changes, and Islam will remain no matter what. But that's what they did, and that's what they plotted and planned since World War I and even before, to make sure that this region never rises again. Islam never rises again from Bilad al-Sham.
Yeah, subhanAllah. And so fast forward, obviously, this time last year, there's that critical moment in which HTS forces move into Damascus and liberate it from the clutches of the Assad regime, and obviously Assad then flees to Russia. So what's happened after the liberation of, or if you want to call it a liberation of Syria after the Assad regime?
Yeah, I've come to that point, I think, but there's a particular point where some people believe that he was toppled by America or the West or some or similar lines. I think this point needs to be dealt with because some people have been misinformed about this reality. But we say unequivocally that not at all. America, the West, did everything possible to keep Assad in power. And Assad fell in spite of the international will. That's a very important point to keep in mind. This revolution was blessed from start to finish in terms of the outcomes it reached, the fall of Assad. Assad could not have sustained this brutal campaign over 14 years without cover-up and being able to do so by the Western powers.
Sorry, Anas, just let me push back a bit, because there's a lot of commentators that highlight Russia's role in sort of propping up the Assad regime. And so obviously, since Assad has been in power, we know that Russia has played, and Iran as well, has played a significant role in funding the regime, ensuring that weapons reach the regime in order to quash the resistance. And so therefore, logically, the conclusion follows that the Assad regime was then toppled by America, right? So what can you say about that?
Yeah, that's absolutely false. And anyone that traces the events of the Syrian revolution and has been a close observer and follower of the Syrian revolution knows very well that America wasn't interested in toppling Assad. And if it did, it would have done so easily. Imagine America cannot take out Assad. That's laughable. In fact, Rob Ford was the most active participant, the America's representatives to Syria and the Middle East at the time during the Syrian uprising. He said explicitly at the time, there's some statements by him where he's saying that there are people that say America was intending to topple Assad, but he's saying, and I quote, that toppling Assad wasn't our goal before, and it shouldn't be now. In another statement by Rob Ford, he said that everybody knew that Assad, or he said before that the only policy America was willing to engage was more sanctions. And everybody knew that Assad wasn't going to step down because we upped the sanctions. That was understood. So merely employing sanctions is not going to do much. And when we look at the statements and by Kerry and Lavrov and how they were facilitating the entrance of Russia into Syria, and that was well known. Russia and America were closely coordinating at the time, and Russia was only in Syria by the permission and enablement of America to do the dirty work on its behalf to crush the revolution. And even Iran and its militias, if you've noticed at the time, Iran and its militias all the way from Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then Hezbollah was allowed to intervene. And the West and America turned a blind eye. They were not designated as terrorist organizations, were they? No. Whereas the Sunnis or the Muslims that rushed to Syria to help the Syrian uprising, they were labeled as terrorists, and they were fought, and they were brutally targeted by America and the coalition. So these are just some of the things that point out to one fact and one fact only, and that is that the West led by America did everything possible to keep Assad in power. And this was clearly the case, and the Syrian people knew that. So, for instance, in Syria, sometimes the realities are distorted. Whereas the Syrians, it was clear some of the chants in the uprising itself, they were not under any illusion that this is a fact. They were calling Ya Bashar, Ya Jaban, Ya Amil American, or Bashar, you're a coward, you are an agent of the Americans. So the Syrians knew that, and they knew that Assad could not have remained in power without American approval and enablement.
Yeah, but one of the things as well that we did see in the lead up to the toppling of the Assad regime, in the weeks leading up to the toppling of the Assad regime, it was really interesting to see the news and the narrative that was being shaped. So, for example, you had CNN that was on the ground in Syria, that was interviewing Shara as well before Damascus was taken. And this sort of, to some observers, indicates that the regime was toppled by America. So how should we read the events, especially the weeks leading up to the toppling of the Assad regime?
Okay, that's a very good question, and there are details here, because when we say that Assad wasn't toppled by America, it doesn't mean that they had not been working to contain the outcome. So they're two separate matters. America was intending to keep Assad for the interim phase, and again, if when the battle of the Ghadir Adwan deterrence operation was launched, it wasn't intended to reach Damascus. That wasn't the intention of that. The weeks leading up to the fall of Assad, that's a very important point to be mentioned here. America had always maintained that the solution to Syria is a political solution, whereby Assad would come to the table with the opposition and they would form a new constitution, a new transitional government. Now, HTS did not have an issue with that, and we'll maybe talk about that later on. They were already implementing the outcomes of the agreements that happened in Astana and Sochi, as per, based on the agreement they had, and Turkey was the guarantor of that agreement. The only obstacle to that was Assad. And just in the weeks prior to Assad's fall, Assad starts to play hardball. He starts to be a bit more stubborn. In his ear were the Iranians, because the Iranians were being targeted and their role was being undermined in the region. They realized that our time is up. America is no longer in need of our role, so we are being reduced. Our role is being reduced in the region, so we need to play tough. We need to have, obviously, as part of any negotiations, you have cards, they have cards, you have tools, they have tools. One of their biggest tools was Assad, and they wanted to use Assad in their bargaining on the bargaining table, and that's why they played tough. And if you recall, Erdogan, he called Assad actually to meet with him, and as part of redeeming Assad. And if we recall that, Assad was actually being redeemed and brought back into the Arab League. And Arab League is an American, a bunch of American agents. So he was brought back to the Arab League. He was being integrated back in the world, and he was being prepared to meet with Erdogan in order to reach the agreement. But Assad, subhanallah, we call that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blinds the tyrants. They become blindly arrogant. It's blind arrogance. They don't see the situation. They don't see the outcome of their actions, and Allah subhanallah makes them go towards their demise. And that's exactly what happened. Assad played tough. He does not want to meet with Erdogan, so the operation deterrence was launched in order to pinch the ear of Assad, come back on the table, to apply pressure on Assad. And the intention of that was to capture parts of Aleppo. And they had estimated, based on even revolutionary sources, that it will take 6 months to capture Aleppo. So that was the estimation. But subhanallah, HTS wanted something, Turkey wanted something, America wanted something, Assad wanted something, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted something else entirely. The Assad forces rapidly, withdrew and retreated from their fronts, and the brigades, when they saw that, thousands upon thousands joined, and it was too late to contain this. And then it was just a matter of how do we contain the outcome, and that's where we say yes, America did. They were scrambling to contain the outcome, but in the lead up, when they saw that Assad, there's no way he can be saved, then they facilitated a managed transition. So the transition to the new government was managed 100%. Sharia walks into Damascus. That was part of the deal that Assad's gone. We have a vacuum now. And Sharia is someone that we can rely on to preserve the status quo because of his track record in that regard. And he walks into Damascus and being appointed as transitional ruler of Syria, because at the end of the day, this is a reality that they have to deal with. But yeah, it was a managed transition to something that they can safely rely on to maintain the status quo and prevent a worse outcome for the West, which is an Islamic state being formed or established.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. But one of the things that is interesting about the outcome is the fact that you have someone like Shara, who was an active fighter, obviously as well in some of the interviews that I've seen as well that he, during his days, during the Syrian Revolution, where he's very critical of America, he's very critical of the West's role in the region, and really, for me, his quotes and his interviews were like the normative stance, like the Islamic normative stance with regards to dealing with, these Western governments. So why did America allow someone like Shara to to replace Assad in the management of this transition that you're speaking about?
Okay, that's a good question, and here we need to unpack a few things, because when you take a step back towards what was happening in Syria. So we said the America's policy towards Syria, or the revolution in Syria, was to crush it, and to that end they allowed Assad to be unleashed, the Iranian militias, Russia, Iran, and everyone, but they all failed to crush this revolution. So the alternative to that, and that's a Western playbook anyway, anyone that knows much about how the West employs its strategy through hard power and soft power, it employed the soft power, the containment policy, which applied many elsewhere in the Muslim world successfully, very successfully. And HTS was, in a nutshell, a reflection of the soft power, because HTS came about in the context where it was being propped up in order to consolidate the brigades. There was so many brigades. and the key point here I'd like to say is America also, and the West in general, failed to sell the nationalistic / secular, even moderate Muslim representatives for the Syrian revolution. They were rejected without any doubt. Mu'adh al-Khatib, SNC, Syrian National Council, coalition, they were all rejected. So in order to gain any legitimacy in Syria, in the revolution, you had to wear the Islamic garment, and you had to adopt the Islamic calling and adopt the Islamic sentiments of the people, because that's what they wanted. The Syrian revolution wasn't just about liberating Syria from the tyranny of Assad. It was about building something else on the basis of Islam. This is anybody that followed the Syrian revolution knows that very well. So anyone that wanted to represent the Syrian revolution had to raise the Islamic banners, and that's what HTS did. They came in, they said, we want to implement Sharia, we want to consolidate the different fractions into one umbrella organization called HTS. And they did this by carrot and stick and by coercion in some instances, and in some instances there was a lot of injustices done. And there's a lot of revolutionary people in Idlib and elsewhere. They were pointing to this at the time, and they talked about the injustices and of HTS, and even someone like iconics like even Abdelbasit Sarut, who everyone knows. Sarut has videos where he speaks up against Julani himself, how he was forcefully and unjustly trying to exert influence over everybody else. So the HTS was being supported by Turkey. They were working day and night to consolidate everyone. But then, as we said, they walk into Damascus, and suddenly they do not meet the demands of the revolution. So they do not implement the Sharia. They don't even the white banner, that the white flag of Islam they used to carry as the banner. They all of a sudden they dropped it from day one. And that's not just a banner. The white banner is representative of the Islamic nature of this revolution, where it has Islamic aims and objectives. And to that end, I think it was evident that something else is going on. And as you pointed out, he's going into saying something.
Yeah. Sorry to cut you off, Anas. Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned previously as well was that in the months prior to the fall of the Assad regime, the West was trying very ardently to try to make a coalition government, which included Assad and elements of HTS, elements of the resistance, and they were in talks. And that perhaps was one of the indicators of what was to come after the fall of the Assad regime. Could you tell us about those negotiations and those sort of agreements, those compromises early on that we saw from the resistance element?
Yep. That's a good question. As I said, America's position, as well as the key powers that were involved in Syria, they were all in agreement that the only solution in Syria was a political solution. And that was based on the 2015 Resolution 2254, which was passed. Resolution 2254, which was passed by the UN, talked explicitly that there needs to be a political solution in Syria, a Syrian-led transition, a new secular constitution, a UN-supervised elections, and that was the pathway towards creating peace in Syria. And then to that end, in order to make that happen, there was negotiations between Russia, between Turkey, between Iran, and above them was America in the picture, in Astana, in Sochi, the two cities in Kazakhstan and Sochi. And these talks primarily talked about how to make it happen. How do we reach the political solution? So they talked about what they called a cessation of hostilities. So let's freeze the fronts. Let's create ceasefires by which we can use that as a model to freeze the entire revolution, which would pave the way for the political settlement. And that's exactly what HTS did. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was implementing the outcomes of the Sochi and Astana agreement on the ground. And everybody in the revolution knew that at the time. HTS comes in, starts to implement that. They start to freeze fronts, even though the revolutionists had the upper hand. And people were asking questions, what's going on here? We were able to take more land from Assad. We were able to liberate more areas. And by that time, the revolution had already lost Aleppo and lost many areas. But at one point, HTS was being asked, why are we retreating? Why are we letting go of these funds? But that was implementing the agreements. Okay, and that's an important point of creating this de-escalation to pave the way for the thing. And one important point I just want to mention here as well, in the lead up to the deterrence battle, deterrence of aggression battle, rather Adwan, protests were erupting in Idlib. And anyone who goes back to that period, the months prior to the battle, protests erupted in big numbers, and they were taking even more and more momentum. What were these protests calling for? They were condemning Jolani. They were calling him a sellout for accepting to freeze the funds and to work towards the political solution. And Sheikh Abdul Razzaq al-Dimashqi al-Mahdi, he is very well known in Syria today. He speaks about that recently. He says, I was part of these movements, and I was condemning Jolani until Jolani one day he summoned me and said, he talked to me quietly. He said to me, Sheikh, you gotta calm things down. This is not acceptable. And he was talking to me in a quiet and calm tone. He said, but because I insisted, I said I took a principled approach. This was unacceptable. You are taking us on a dead end. So he continued with the protests, and weeks later, I think 3 months before the key battle, Jolani calls him again, he says, and this was with an angry tone. He was fuming. He was fuming. He said, today you need to stop this momentum. You need to stop these protests. And I want to say something that not many people know. One of the key reasons why the deterrence operation was launched, in addition to it being to slap on the wrist for Assad, is because of the pressure mounting on HTS and Jolani to resume the fighting. The fighters were frustrated. Everybody was frustrated. We want to liberate Syria. This is not what we came here for. So this was one of the best ways to diffuse that pressure, to contain these sentiments, and to say, here we are back and we are fighting. But as I said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted something else, subhanAllah.
Subhanallah. And so obviously Damascus is ultimately fallen. The Assad regime departs. And recently, in fact, a few months ago, or a couple of months ago maybe, you visited Syria personally. And can you just tell us what it felt like on the ground? Obviously, you're speaking about the lead up to the fall of Assad, HTS taking over, Jolani being the president or the interim leader of Syria. What does it feel like on the ground? What did you observe when you were there on the ground in Syria?
Yeah, alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had blessed us with a few brothers to go and visit Syria after the liberation. And what I would say, in a nutshell, it was such an uplifting and inspiring experience, to be honest. It was a short time, but in that short of time, we were able to see firsthand what this revolution did to the people and transformed into something else, subhanAllah. obviously you will see the huge relief on people's faces in the sentiments on the streets. They had something that's happened. It's like a dream come true. They had never imagined that they would wake up one day without Assad being there. You know, that's something that Syrians could not have imagined. That's how big of an event this was. You know, people were, again, you hear a lot of stories there. And part of the stories is the thousands upon thousands who were just kidnapped and killed, subhanAllah. Up until today, you find mass graves in Syria. Thousands upon thousands in mass graves just because they're Muslims, for no crime that they committed. So people used to pay a lot of big money, big sums, just to find out about the fate of their sons and daughters, whether they're alive or dead. Imagine the situation at that time. So they've just come out of this misery, this brutal 50-year period. So naturally, there's a huge relief. But one of the things something that is so reassuring and just confirms the realities for us, how blessed is Bilad al-Sham, that we are reminded once again of the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you go there, you feel that. You know, this is a piece of land that was subjected to the most brutal of measures to suppress Islam to never rise again, oppress Muslims to the point that is unimaginable. But we are reminded that Islam is the only permanent thing over there in Bilad al-Sham. You know, you go there and you ask, where's the baptism? Where's the bath? It's in dustbin of history. Where's Al-Assad family? It's gone. The only thing that remains is Islam. Everything is temporary, and and that's a message to us as Muslims, especially today where we live in today's time and agency, the massacres and genocide in Gaza and everywhere. And it can easily push us towards hopelessness or despair. But we as Muslims, we know that in the flip of a moment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will change everything. The entire situation can be flipped on its head. And with perseverance, with patience, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will change the situation if we take by the means. So this is Bilad al-Sham, this is the blessed Bilad al-Sham. But one of the important things I came to see is the type of people this revolution produced. 14 years of revolution produced a type of Muslim identity, and here I'm talking about collective identity, not just individual, that we haven't seen in the Ummah since the fall of the Khilafah. You know, the elements, the aspects of Islam that have been absent from our collective life, absent from our masajid, absent from our institutions. The notions of Khilafah, Sharia, Jihad, sacrifice, martyrdom, these aspects that give the Ummah life that we have seen in Gaza, just in the past 2 years. In Syria, it's the same. It's been the same experience. The spirits are high for Islam. The spirits are high for martyrdom. The spirits are high for sacrifice. And everybody has one message, that it's unfinished business. This is not the end. We didn't sign up for this yet. This is something bigger. And everybody is just waiting for the next phase. No one is resting. No one is saying this is it. No one is saying this is what we signed up for, as in what we're seeing today in Syria. But everybody just, this is the reality that we have to grapple with. But we have aspired and we are working towards something bigger that will change the face of the Muslim world.
So is it safe to say that when you visited Syria, it was, life was really good for the people? The institutions, the learning institutions were free to teach. People were buying, selling. You saw economic life flourishing. People were living in safety. Was that your observation there, being on the ground?
It's a mix. It's a mix, really. They've just come out of the 14 years, so it depends on the areas as well. So you see some areas completely devastated. We walked into Hay Jobar, which was one of the key battlefronts, because it's on the outskirts of Damascus, and it's completely destroyed. It's like the scenes you see in Gaza. You see camps, you see people trying to rebuild. You see people doing. But one thing you see in common is, subhanallah, this sakina, tranquility. And that's something you can't rationalize from a Western point of view. Here, if our day didn't go as planned, you become so frustrated, subhanAllah. But there, you ride the taxi, you mix with the people in the markets, you mix with the average people, and everybody just has this sakina and tranquility. So the situation is not easy. It's obviously it's a transitional period, but yes, subhanallah, it's just the people are easygoing. They're very hospitable. Hospitality is next level, subhanallah, there. and everybody is just relieved and has this tranquility in them, despite the difficulty, of course, in the situation on the ground.
Subhanallah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he give the people of Bilad al-Sham success bi'idhnillah ta'ala in this life and in the hereafter. So like by all accounts, things have improved, even by your observations as well. Things in Syria have improved. And that leads us on to sort of the next part of this discussion, which is post-Assad regime with Shara at the helm as leader of Syria. How should we view his leadership? Obviously, I know in your analysis, you were highlighting certain collaborations that he previously had in the lead up with the West, some of the compromises that he's made. But, there is an argument that, we need to give him some time to settle. We need to allow him the space in order to, get the affairs together, to set things on the right track. And so when we see images, for example, of him at the White House shaking hands with Donald Trump, etc., because of the bigger picture, and I know I've heard this a lot as well, people using the maslaha mafsada paradigm, right? That there's a greater maslaha because you see people, as you are on the ground, people are safe now, the regime is gone. By far and large, things are better. We just need to give him some space and some time. What's your take on that?
Okay, I think two things here. The things are better. It's from the first perspective, which we talked about, which is that Assad has fallen. The period of tyranny has ended of the Assad regime and the horrors and the terror inflicted upon the Muslims in Syria. And that's ended, alhamdulillah. So that comes with a lot of relief, and things are better from that perspective. But when we talk about the revolution, akhi, we know that any revolution or any change anywhere, you look at two things always. You got to look at two things. One is the downfall or dismantling what's existing, and then building something in its place. It's always the two. You go hand in hand. You can't topple something and have no alternative. And they say, Ansaf al-Thawrat Maqbarat al-Thawar. The saying goes along the lines is going or achieving half the revolution is setting the scene for the graveyard of the revolutionaries, meaning that you are digging your own grave if you don't have an alternative. In the case of Syria, I think our assessment, and I will come to the give him time thing, but I think from a high level perspective, when we want to assess Syria after the fall of Assad, we need to ask ourselves, what is our assessment based on? What is our measure? What is our expectation? If it was about just removing Assad, then yes, that's achieved. Alhamdulillah, that's achieved. And there are people, out there, even in Syria, there's a segment of society in Syria that have not been participants in the revolution. They were just normal people, and they were happy to see Assad go, but that's about it. For them, that's about it. Let's build Syria as another nation state, etc. And this is the trajectory that Syria is taking. And we saw that, as soon as Shara came to power, the priority is given to international legitimacy. Let's rebuild economic development. But we know well that, this comes at a price. You cannot approach the world that we know, especially after Gaza. You cannot approach the same world and say we want to rebuild and we want economic development without expecting that this will be at a cost. The world powers and international institutions are not charity organizations. And in this respect, if you want to maintain this line and take this to its natural conclusion, at the end of the day, what do you want? What has this path given us? Just look at the neighboring countries. Look at Jordan, look at Lebanon, look at Egypt, where this path has taken them. The path of conforming to the world order, the path of appeasing the world order, and in the hope that you might get something in return. The only thing that they get in return is that those in power will get their time in power, yes, but that's about it. If that's the intention, yes, they might achieve that. But in terms of revival, in terms of prosperity, in terms of people getting their dignity, far from. The best example of that, I would say, is that the pre-Assad versus post-Assad, the ones that say, having Assad gone is good enough, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, is the example of a person who was being put in a cell, in a small cell, 3x3, with 15 other inmates. But then they decide to take him out of that cell, put him in a bigger cell, 6x6 with only 3 people. That seems like an upgrade, doesn't it? But you're still in the jail. You're still in the jail that they called nation state for you, and the same tools are being employed to keep you under the boots of the Americans in the world order. Look at the capitals: Cairo, Amman, Beirut, shackled, colonized, exploited, humiliated. That's the situation. So, do we want another nation state after 2 million were martyred in this blessed revolution, 15 million displaced? So give him time to do what exactly? To go where? And even this question of giving time, it's like as if somebody has a gun on his head. He's got all the time, and he's had 1 year. But if by giving him time, people mean let's see where this ends up, well, the signs are there, and the signs are being clear and getting clearer day by day, month by month. The trajectory is clear. Where is this going? If you see somebody cycling, if you see a brother or sister cycling towards the end of a cliff, would you say give him time? You would try to save him. That's why even those who think that he's doing ijtihad and his maslahah and he's sincere, even they need to account, and they need to see the dangers of this. صديقك من صدقك لا من صدقك. Your true friend is the one that tells you be careful. You're going to fall down. You're gonna hit a dead end. Not the one that cheers you on and gets you in a bigger trouble than you are now. So there's no deny the situation is difficult. It's just that the trajectory is only leading one way, and conforming to the world order and its demands will, and we see it, compromise after compromise. A small compromise will lead to bigger compromises. And that's at the expense of your sovereignty, at the expense of the demands of the revolution, at the expense of your political independence, at the expense of your true independence as a state even. So that's, I think, some just pointers to get to allow us to think about these things in a broader sense.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. And as you were speaking about the track record of the international world order, nation state system that we've sort of shackled ourselves towards, and that some of the Muslims unfortunately are still advocating for as a lesser of the two evils. I mean, what lesser of the two evils? You rightly highlighted 2 million killed in Syria. We had 1 million, killed after the Iraq War. We've had, hundreds and thousands being the genocide that's happening in Gaza. You have the Rohingya people being massacred. You have the Muslims of Xinjiang. So the international world order, this architecture of nation states, has not and has never served our interests. And I think you're right in saying where's the maslahah? Where is the benefit? I mean, how is this a greater maslahah when we know what they've done in our history in terms of maslahah and mafsada? I think we've given the international world order and its architecture of nation states enough chances, and we should start looking elsewhere. So
another point. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go on.
I'm reminded of another point to you while you're talking, is that this is not simply, as you point out, people cite and invoke different arguments, maslaha and some Islamic arguments and darura and whatnot. But we're not talking, about just simply a difference in manhaj here. If it was a difference in manhaj, in tactics, in styles, that's fine. We differ and we accept that within the Islamic umbrella. But this is not one of them. This is about a trajectory that differs with the fundamentals. You are abandoning its fundamentals of Islamic revival work, of Islamic concepts, in order to appease the West, and not just through words but through deeds. And the other point I'd like to make is that these are not simple mistakes. In some people, there are mistakes here and there. There's they cite that there's darura here and there. This is not a mistake. Is usually when you have a clear project, you are implementing this. You've declared that you want to establish Sharia, for instance. Islam is the reference point, and yes, I can accept that there's mistakes here and there. But this is about fundamentally the trajectory is wrong. Okay, that's a big difference between the two. And the Islamic project, what Islamic project? There is no Islamic project. You know, it doesn't. What's happening today does not lead to an Islamic project. It leads the other way. It takes Syria away from Islamic project. There's no overlap.
Okay, so obviously this is, if it's not an Islamic project, obviously it's an American and Western-led project that's happening in Syria. So that leads us to the other question, which is, what does the US and the West in general want to see in Syria?
Yep, that's a good question. I'll try to keep it as short as possible, but America and the West in general, they want first and foremost to maintain the secular / nationalistic identity of Syria. They are the key tools by which they can maintain their dominance over our land, prevent the return of Islam, prevent the independence of the Ummah, and prevent the start of the revival of the Ummah of Muhammad ﷺ. So maintaining a secular and nationalistic identity of Syria. And, you know, I think we can safely say that's what's happened in Syria today. As soon as the Sharia comes about, and we talked about that sort of West scrambling when they saw Assad falling, they scrambled to contain the outcome, and there was a meeting in Qatar held between the different powers. And the best bet was to bring up Sharia because he's someone that has been cooperating with the West and the regional powers for many years. So he's their best bet in order to preserve the status quo, maintain Syria as a secular and nationalistic identity, eliminate the Islamic threat. And here you can cite anything. They don't care about what you cite. You can cite Islamic evidences. You can bring on shuyukh that say it's maslaha or masada. You can invoke anything. But for them, the outcome is that Syria is maintained as a secular and nationalistic identity. And that's how you eliminate the Islamic threat and preserve Western interests. Now, going forward, and we saw that in the past year, what America wants is to for Sharia to really weaken the revolutionary base, and we see that clearly. You know, Tom Barak is not simply an American politician or advisor to the Middle East. Tom Barak is dictating. Tom Barak is dictating to Assad what he should do, and we subhanallah, it's so humiliating. You need to do this. You need to integrate minorities in the government. You need to be inclusive. You need to integrate SDF into the army. He is dictating to Syria what it should do. And that's the danger we talked about earlier. You have outsourced your political will. You have outsourced your independence. Why? In return for being allowed to rule Syria. And that's the second point, where they need to weaken the revolutionary base. And as we said, we talked about what this revolution did to Syria. Yes, Sharia might be that person that is compliant, but you've got all these, people in the army, across the different institutions for sincere Muslims. All the positions have been filled by sincere Muslims. And here the task is being given to weaken this base by undertaking some steps, which is one of them is to integrate the minorities, and the question of minorities has always been adopted by colonial powers. The Alawites, the Druze, in particular, he needs to integrate them into the government because they are the West's permanent tools, and the Muslims and Sunnis in particular will not be allowed to have any meaningful influence going forward. And that's why he needs to slowly absorb these secular elements, these minorities, these Alawites, these Druze, these different Kurds, nationalistic Kurds, into the government. Moreover, he needs to integrate elements within the army, because the army is a big threat now. They need to slowly remove the Islamic sentiments from their army by integrating SDF, the Syrian democratic forces, and then they were talking about weakening the influence of the extremists in the army. Extremists, of course. What do you mean by that? It's those Islamic leaders who want Sharia in Syria. So they need to keep the noose around his neck until all those are fulfilled. And I'll just add one more point, and that is ultimately what they want to achieve is, and that's a very dangerous point, they want to drive these Islamists into the wall. It is one of the key tenant policies of America to undermine anyone that raises the Islamic banner in the eyes of the people, eyes of the masses. To later say, look, the masses, look, these Islamists are failure. They have nothing new to add. They have no substance. They have no Islamic project. So people lose their trust over these anyone that holds the Islamic banner and Islamic call and Islamic da'wah, because America wants them to fail, wants them to be undermined by complying with what they want and ultimately undermining themselves, undermining what they stood for one day. And that's one of the key outputs. We saw that in Egypt. We see that today, and that's one of the key things that they want to drive it into a wall, because ultimately these these rules, they think they are, once they do 1, 2, 3, they will be kept in power. But no, once their usefulness has expired, they will be let go of.
And I think what's really eye-opening as well, that despite the fact that he's really complied with what America has wanted, and what the West has wanted in general. We still, for example, in recent weeks and months, have seen continued bombings in Syria by the Zionist entity. Now, how does that all fit in with what you just said before about what America and the West want in Syria?
Yeah, things are a bit more convoluted with the Zionists. The Zionist entity, there's nothing rational about what they do at the moment. So it's not like, we need to make sense or rationalize what the Zionists are doing. There's nothing rational about what they're doing. Post 7 October, the Zionist entity has been driven by an absolute state of paranoia and hysteria. That's the state in which they're in at the moment. They, even to the extent, they've gone to the extent that in the Palestinian Authority, no one has served the interests of the Zionists more than the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas. Yet, despite that, the Zionists have undermined them over and over again. And they said repeatedly, we don't want the Palestinian Authority to rule Gaza. It's mind-boggling how cheap these agents can be. And that's just to show you that the Zionists are acting in a way that is irrational, despite whatever reassurances. The Syrian government from day one, it has done everything possible to reassure the Zionist entity. We are not here to threaten you. We want to maintain regional stability. We want to pave the way for regional peace. They even said that. But yet, despite that, the Zionists are bombing Syria day and night. And that talks of one, the hysteria, and two, because the Zionists know very well that what's in Syria, that the change that happened in Syria is deep. Yes, forget the head. Assad is removed, but then there's this now on the ground. It's all Islam. It's all sentiments for liberation, and people want to liberate Bayt al-Maqdis. They know that very well, and that's why they want a peace of submission with Syria. Syria is saying, okay, we want, I'm not going to harm you. Let's reach a deal, but the Zionists want to go further than them. They want peace, but on their terms. I want Syria to disarm completely from Damascus up until the south. Again, back to my point. You compromise once, you compromise many times. Now we don't know to what end the Syrian government will compromise, but that's just to show you they believe the Syrian government can compromise. So we need to push them towards that. And we need to, because we know that there are Muslims on the border now that are sincere. If they have the chance, they would open up a front against the Zionists. And in addition to that, the Zionists have an expansionist policy, and that's no secret. Going back to 1967 and after, they occupied the Golan Heights, and that's something that they always do. They occupy one place, and they impose a new reality, which becomes the basis for any future negotiations. It's like they take it for granted. This is ours now. Let's look at the next piece of land. So they want to take up more land from Syria, and then just use that as bargaining tool in any negotiations. So they want to impose new realities. They want to take up more land, and that's their policy. That's their policy, subhanAllah.
So yeah, it does seem like a very difficult position for someone like Shara to inherit, like in the sense that you almost can understand the compromises that are being made in order to serve what he thinks are the best interests of the Syrian people. But as you mentioned, this just leads to further entrenching yourself within the world order, and also as well accepting these compromises that are ultimately going to lead to your demise. And so the pragmatic approach that that is taken, obviously you can understand it, but history tells us something different, that it's going to lead you somewhere else. So this leads us ultimately to what is the way forward then for Syria. I know we've spoken a lot about these other perspectives that talk about the greater maslaha, the greater benefit, etc. So what should be the way forward for Syria and the people of Syria?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I think it comes up a lot. In when we talk to people, they say, what other path can Syria have taken apart from the path that it has taken, given the reality around us, given the circumstance. Which again, it's another point, because you would think that anyone who wanted to rule Syria after Assad is toppled, he would think about this reality in the first place, or before Assad is toppled, and he would be ready for that. So you cannot use the reality and the challenges and the obstacles as a reason to, or as a justification for the compromises, because the same constraints and challenges were there 10 years ago when you were working to topple Assad, and you were saying back then that despite this reality, despite the enemies, we are going to implement Islam. So that's just a point to keep in mind, that it's not good enough to use the reality to suggest that there's no other way. But on this point, I think there's a fundamental point here. And here I would like people to go back to the day that Damascus fell or was liberated. Because here you are at a crossroad. There's a crossroad here. And you have one of two choices, really. There's no third choice. It's one of two choices. One is to conform. And as we said, conforming to the demands of the international order. You want to lift sanctions, you want to rebuild. You need to conform. But here will come at a huge price that will take away your sovereignty and independence of political will, and will lead to your demise with time. No doubt about that. So this path is ultimately wrong, and it will lead to your failure and demise sooner or later. So really that leaves us with one other option. And here I'd like people, again, just before I mention that option, is that we've been taught to think within the box for so long. You need to think within the box. You're being presented with one option, and you cannot think outside the box. SubhanAllah, if you do, you're some sort of irrational, and you do not take what as bad, etc. But really, we talk about a revolution here that will bring about radical change. So the second option was, once you enter Damascus, is not to conform and to build something that represents the aspirations and the goals of this revolution. And this revolution, when we talk about this revolution, my brother and our listeners, this revolution, it defied all the odds. So to those that say Syria is weak, people are weak, what can we do? Well, let's not forget that this revolution defied all the odds. And in spite of America, in spite of Israel, in spite of the international will, it toppled Assad after 14 years. Is this a revolution that's weak? SubhanAllah. So what I'm saying is, this is a mindset issue more than anything else. This weakness, this weakness that's been instilled in order to pave the ground for compromises, nothing more, nothing less. Yes, look, there's no question that the balance of power is not on our side. The material power is not on our side. Yes, that's a matter of fact. But that's the point. If the question was, do we wait for the balance of power to be on our side, or to be to be of similar size to our enemies before we make bold moves, or before we make principled steps, then this revolution would never have started in the first place. So a revolution that was able to defy all the odds was because of one thing and one thing only. That is, it had the willpower, it had the right mindset, it had the right vision, it had the right mission. And with the Islamic concepts that we invoke day and night about tawakkul, about patience, about perseverance, about steadfastness, that's the formula for victory for this ummah. And all it takes is just leadership that takes the ummah with this vision and mission towards the ultimate objective, which is the revival of the ummah. This ummah has agency, it has capabilities, it has capacity. Only if you have a leadership that can leverage and take advantage of what you have in order to force a new reality outside of what's existing today, outside of what we've tried for the last 100 years. The last 100 years has been marked by one unfortunate aspect, is that we shed a lot of blood, we sacrifice a lot, but we end up with something that does not represent our aspirations and liberation. Even all the way from Algeria until today. People cite Algeria. Yes, Algeria paid a heavy price for liberation, but what was the end? A nation state that is subservient to the West up until today, colonized politically, economically. Is that what we want? To repeat the same cycle? So I think that's what we need to think about. We need to think about this topic from an Islamic perspective, from a principle perspective, and think about the potential that's out there. And what I would say here in this regard is that, one of the biggest mistakes the HTS did when it reached Damascus is that it declared that the revolution has ended and the state era has started. And obviously this links back to the deal that was made. You need to end the revolution here and reach a deal whereby you don't touch particular elements or areas or remnants of regime, or the strongholds of the Alawites and the Kurds and the pockets of rebellion. But any observer, and people talked about that at the time, the revolution did not end at that time. The revolution should have continued, and because the momentum was on its side, and they should have kept going, and within a couple of days they would have gotten control and dominance over more lands in Syria, and they would have cleaned up Syria from the remnants of the old regime and from the heads of fitna and chaos. But unfortunately, it took a route where it wanted to get international legitimacy and integration within the regional network and the international powers, which is unfortunate. Now, one important point to keep in mind is that this path, what I'm talking about, is obviously, it's not easy. It's not something that is guaranteed or easy. It's one that's filled with hardships, obviously, but it's something that we need to remember, that we as an ummah have been paying a heavy price and rivers of blood for decades for taking the pragmatic approach and for taking the seemingly easy approach.
And I think that's a very important point, right? Is that when we limit our imagination to the borders that were drawn up by, during that Sykes-Picot agreement by the British and the French and the European powers, we're limiting the potential of the region. And when you just think of Syria itself, obviously it's limited in terms of its resources, its strategic position, etc. But when you think about the entire region, so not only Syria in isolation of Jordan and these other countries, but you think of it as one region united, it's got amazing amount of resources, right? And it's a very, as you said in the very beginning, it's a very important strategic position in the world. And so when you think of it in those terms, where you sort of break yourself, as you kept on repeating, from the shackles of this colonialist mindset of these borders, and subhanallah, the border between Syria and Jordan, there's like a straight line. And so that just indicates, it's just, they're basically mocking us that, we're the ones that drew up these borders and you're the ones that are confining yourselves to this. And so long as we limit our imagination to the Sykes-Picot borders, then ultimately we're going to be doomed for failure. And to your other point, which is that, go on, Son.
Yeah, actually, because you remind me of this point, which is very relevant to our discussion today, and just shows you the potential out there. Last year in March, Ramadan, when the Alawites erupted and caused a bit of chaos in Syria, what happened then? 500,000 Muslim men rose up in the space of 4 hours. 4 hours it took for 500,000 Muslims, armed Muslims, to rally after midnight to go and defend their lands. Moreover, when events happened in Suriye'deki with the Druze, and more recently, what happened? The tribes rose up, not just in Syria, but beyond, in Jordan, in Iraq, in even in Saudi. What does that tell you? It just shows you the potential out there. The potential out there, that if you had the vision, if you had the leadership to leverage what's happening. Because one thing we need to keep in mind is that this region is boiling. This region, on one hand, this region is boiling on the backdrop of what happened in Gaza and all the decades of tyranny by these rulers. And on the other hand, the region is boiling, and the other point is the the situation internationally is in your favor, to be honest. The international order is disintegrating before your eyes. So it's not true that we are weak. Just as America, Israel have cards and tools, we too have cards and tools. We have leverage, we have agency, we have capabilities. Only if you look inward, then you will see the potential out there. And the point is, yes, I was going to say the situation, the Ummah is boiling, and the borders are fragile. They're as fragile as ever. And we just talked about these examples, just to show you that when we take the pragmatic and seemingly easier approach, you think that you have saved the Ummah. But yes, in the short term, you might secure Syrian. But in the long run, what would happen? You would end up paying a lot more in terms of bloodshed. And you'll end up suffering more and pay double the price for wanting to be liberated again from the same world order that gave us Asad and gave us Sisi and all these talents. So I think that's some aspects that we need to start thinking about, that things are not as, people like to make it seem it's impossible to get out of this architecture. No, it is possible. It's more than possible, especially today when the situation has not been better in that regard than it has now for the past 100 years.
Yeah, subhanAllah. And I think if we look back at the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ and we look at the stances of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, we see that there were many moments in which the pragmatic approach made the most sense, right? And I think an example that highlights this most was the army of Osama bin Zayd being dispatched by the Prophet ﷺ. And after the Prophet ﷺ had passed away, the Sahaba had gathered amongst themselves and they were dealing with all of these problems, regional problems, right? You had the Harb al-Ridda, Hurub al-Ridda, you had Musaylima al-Kadhab, you had all of these different issues that sprung up within the region domestically that Abu Bakr had to address radiallahu anhu. And Umar bin Khattab as well was saying that his beloved companion, Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu, he was saying that we have all of these problems and you want to, continue with the dispatching of the army of Osama bin Zayd. And he said, and he took the beard of Umar bin Khattab and he said, how can I not fulfill the commandment of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And despite all of the domestic issues, and the pragmatic mind would automatically come to the conclusion that we need to address these immediate issues first. That's what I would think, right? But he was only thinking of, I need to follow the command of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And by doing that and seeking the pleasure of Allah Azza wa Jal, we know what happened afterwards, right? That the Romans, they got the message that, whoa, these guys, we thought they had internal issues with people reneging on Islam after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, etc. But the army's charging forward. Our news was wrong, and we need to retreat. And so by following Allah's command and realizing as well that we have such a depth within our tradition, within Islam itself, regarding how to run an economy, how to govern people, how to run a state. All of these things can be found within our tradition. And so by looking at our deen and seeking solutions from within our deen, it's the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, the history of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum tell us that this is ultimately going to lead to our victory, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to add to what I said. Across our most decisive moments in history were marked by this similar theme, to be honest. It was never about the material aspect. It was never about the balance of power. It was just about your confidence in your own deen. It's like قال موسى لقومه استعينوا بالله واصبروا. Seek help through Allah and have patience. That's a form of victory. Seek help through Allah, through what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed and mandated of solutions. Do not look for the left, the west, and the east. Seek help through Allah alone and through what Islam allows, and have patience along the way. And we know that our decisive moments in history have been determined by this mindset, by this vision, by this willpower, and determination. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in tansurullah yansurkum. In tansurullah, if you support the cause of Allah, if you implement the deen of Allah, Allah will give you victory. And that's aqidah for us. And that's why it's unfortunate. Some people think it's some sort of a personal issue that we have. There's no personal issues with anyone. This is a matter of a deen. No matter who comes and rules, if they fulfill the covenant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-ain wal-ras, as you say, and he's on our head, whoever it is. But when we see someone come to power and turn 180 point degree against what he used to say himself, and not implement the Sharia and issue pardons and amnesty against the remnants of the regime, and even integrate some of them in the new government, some in the new roles like in Sokrat and Faid al-Sakr, some of them who have images of themselves stepping on corpses and dead Muslims, subhanAllah. And then on the other hand, imprisoning Muslims for nothing except that you differed with them in their opinion. And then you go on and the biggest one recently is you go and join the alliance against Islam, subhanAllah, this so-called international coalition for fighting ISIS, which everybody knows is just a cover for fighting Islam. So it's one thing and having the West launch a war on your land, but it's another thing entirely different when you give political legitimacy and cover for this alliance, when you join them and when you partake and become an ally with them to fight under this notion of fighting ISIS. You are now required to fight anyone that wants to implement the Sharia of Allah in Syria. So where is this going? This is a sincere call to everyone who is concerned about Syria.
Barakallahu feekum, jazakallah khair. Before we wrap up the podcast, do you have any concluding remarks on this?
Look, what I would say is really that despite what we just mentioned of the setbacks and disappointments, despite all of that, I think on the long term, things are moving in the right direction. Syria is a story of an ummah that refuses to surrender, an ummah that refuses to succumb to the colonizers, that refuses to raise the white flag, and it's heading in that direction. No matter what they plot, no matter what they plan, what they're doing, they're just trying to delay the inevitable. That's all what they're trying to do. But al ummah is moving towards that. One thing we need to, just at a high level, just so that we don't feel deflated because of the current trajectory. For 100 years, the ummah has been on the receiving end of onslaughts, and its enemies have been deciding its borders and who should rule it and the systems they should live under. Whereas for the last 10 or 20 years, the ummah has been making a move. The Arab Spring and these revolutions, and what's happening, in Palestine, etc. The ummah is taking a stance. It's moving, and the West is playing catch up. The West is scrambling to contain the outcome. So this is part of the changing of the situation for the good, inshallah. This is part of the transformation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is preparing Bilad al-Sham in the Muslim lands for better days ahead, inshallah. And we know, as the hadith tell us, that after the Ahd al-Jabri, this tyrannical period, oppressive rule, there will only be a Khilafah Rashida. So we are already told by the Prophet of Allah that after this era of darkness, there will only be one outcome. There won't be a democracy or republican system or another rehashed system. It will only be a Khilafah Rashida. So this is where things are heading. Now, whether people choose to be part of that or not, that's their choice, but the outcome is already determined. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is preparing the Muslims for that, and preparing the Muslims of Syria for the liberation of Bayt al-Maqdis. We saw that when we were in Syria. You see that on the streets of Syria today. You look at the protests, you look at the chants, you look at the sentiments, and all of these point to one reality only, is that they are being prepared for the inevitable. These people are being prepared to lead the Ummah once again, and to lead the revival of the Ummah once again as they did in the past. It's a matter of time, and nothing that the West will do can change that fact. And nothing that the West tries to implement on the ground through different tools will stop that momentum or will stifle it.
Jazakallah khairan wa barakallah feek, Anas, for that, for giving us your time on the podcast and for that brilliant analysis. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasten the victory for Bilad al-Sham and alleviate the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Gaza and elsewhere around the world. And Jazakallah khair as well to our audience for listening to today's podcast. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it from our good deeds, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And with that, we end, and we hope to see you, inshallah, on the next episode of the Narrative House podcast. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.